In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to create an application that connects to a database and displays that information somehow in the application. I would highly encourage you to take a look at the lesson text for lesson 18 before you get started watching this video. It'll give you some background information on the purpose of databases, how to connect to a database, and the objects that we'll use in this video in order to enable that functionality. So the first thing I'm going to do is create in my Server Explorer a data connection. Think of a data connection as kind of a shortcut that you can use across all of the projects that you'll create within your instance of Visual Studio on your local computer. So in the future, if you need to create a reference to a database such as the one that we're going to use now, you don't have to go through this step each and every time. You can merely use some of the preset settings for the connection to the database and use that across all your applications. For example, we're going to have to select an OLEDB provider. This is a layer of software that knows how to communicate with the specific database that we'll choose to work with. In this case, we're going to work with an Access database, which requires that we work with some version of the Microsoft Jet OLEDB provider. You might have an earlier version than 4.0. That's okay. Go ahead and select it. Then click the Next button. Based on the OLEDB provider that you select, the content of the next tabs will probably be different. In this case, since we're connecting to a file and not a database server, we'll need to select the file name on our hard drive. If you navigate to the C:/begin1 directory, you should have a version of the Northwind database available to you. If not, I've made it available to you in this video zip file, so make sure to open up the zip file where you found this video and the source code, and there will be a database and you can put it anywhere in your hard drive. Just remember where you put it because you'll need to select it at this point. I put it in the begin1 directory since most of the lessons have pointed you there up to this point. I'm going to click the Open button now. And you probably don't need to make any other changes on any other tabs or any of the other fields of the Connection tab. All you really need to do is click the Test Connection button to ensure that your connection to this database works. Since it's worked successfully, we'll click the OK button, and now we'll see a new data connection in the Server Explorer that we can use in all of our applications. The next thing that we want to do is actually create a new WinForms application, and we'll put it in the Lesson 18 directory of the Begin1 folder. I'm going to click OK, and after a moment or two we get a new Windows Form application within our Visual Studio.NET IDE. Since we're demonstrating how to connect to a database, the first thing that we'll do is go to Server Explorer where we created our data connection. I'm going to show you a shortcut on how to create a connection to a database. All you have to do is drag and drop the reference to the connection onto the designer, and you'll see in the designer tray a little OLEDB connection 1 instance will appear. The benefit of doing it this way is that it fills in all the connection string information for us and all the specifics of how to connect to this database. Alternatively, we can go to the toolbox, select the Data tab, and drag and drop an OLEDB connection object onto our designer surface, in which case then we'll have to come over here and fill out the connection string information manually. Let's go ahead and delete this second one and focus on using the first one. Again, a connection object merely knows how to communicate with your target database that you want to interact with in your application. In order to actually use the data in the database, you'll need some other objects. The next object that we're going to look at is a command object. I'm going to go to the toolbox in the Data tab, and I'm going to select the OLEDB command and drag and drop that onto the designer surface, which gives me an OLEDB command 1 object in my designer tray. Now we're going to have to fill out some information for this, so I'm going to tack down the properties window. And what I want to do is go to this command text property and click the ellipsis to the right. Now notice here it says that it cannot create a command text for this object because we haven't associated a connection with it. So I'm going to click the OK button. The very first thing we need to do before we can use our command object is set the connection property, and we'll set it to an existing connection that we have. That's right, our OLEDB connection 1 object. So in order for our command object to work, the first thing we have to tell it is which connection object that we want to use within our application. Let's go back to the properties for the command object. Now, with that in place, we should be able to click the ellipsis, and we get a dialog called a query builder. As I pointed out in the lesson text, you have to use a language called SQL, or SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language, in order to extract information out of the database, or interact with the database pretty much in any way. Now, fortunately, VisualStudio.net gives you a shortcut to creating SQL or SQL for your applications, and that is the Query Builder. The first thing that you need to do is determine what table or tables you're going to use in your query. We're going to keep this one pretty simple and select all of the customer records from the customer table. I'm going to click the Add button, and you'll notice in the background the customer table diagram appears in our Query Builder window. That's the only table that I need for right now, so I'm going to click the Close button. Let's go ahead and focus on the Query Builder for just a moment. Notice that there are several different panes that you can see here. There is a diagram pane. This is called the grid pane, and you'll see its use in just a moment. This is called the SQL pane, and finally this is the results pane. If I wanted to select all of the records out of the customer table, I can use one of these 3 panes in order to specify which records I want to select. In this case, the easiest way for me to do this would just be click the All Columns. And notice what this does. It, first of all, in my grid pane, selects a star in the column field, Table Customers Output with a check mark. There's some other columns like sort type and sort order. We won't talk about those now, but they do allow us to bring back the data from the database in a sorted manner. And then finally, there's a criteria column which allows us to insert a where clause into our SQL statement. We're not going to use that right now either, but we'll come back to that in the next 2 videos in this series. Additionally, it filled out a third panel, or rather pane, and that is the actual SQL command language that was generated as a result of selecting all customers. Now I could unclick this and select just the columns that I need. For example, company name, contact name, and so on. And notice how that changes the values in the grid view or the grid pane and the SQL pane. But for right now, I'm going to just select all columns. And then to make sure that I get the results that I'm expecting, I can test what records will be brought back as a result of executing this SQL statement against my database by right-clicking anywhere in here in my lowest pane, which is called the results pane, and clicking Run. And notice in just a moment, it brings back all of the customer records from the database. For right now, I'm not going to make any other selections. I'm just going to click my OK button. And it's important to notice, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger here, that my text shows up in the command text property. So the SQL text that I created as a result of using the query builder shows up here now in my command text field. So we've used 2 of the 3 objects we're going to need to make this work, our connection object and our command object. Next, let's put some user interface controls on our application here in our application. And I'm just going to pull out this text box, and we're going to fill out some properties. We'll call this txt results I'm going to get rid of the text that's currently in there. And I need to make this multi-line. And we'll probably need to add some scroll bars as well. Let me see, where are the scroll bars? Here they are. And we'll add them both. And so here, I'm going to pull this down. Next thing I'm going to do, set some properties on my button. And now I'm ready to write some code. Let's go ahead and make some room for ourselves, and I'm going to get rid of the properties window for. So the first thing I'm going to do is create or dimension a variable called dr as oladb.oladb data reader. And this will be the bucket for the information that comes back from the database. This is what we will actually look at whenever we try to view the records that have been returned as a result of executing our SQL statement on the command object. The next thing that we need to do is now tell our command object to execute our reader. Now what this will do is return an object of type oladb data reader. So this is what we'll do. dr equals oladb command1.execute reader. At this point, if everything went okay, then we should have records in our data reader now. What we need to do is loop through our data reader, take each record, look at it one by one, and then determine what we're going to display in our text box. So what I'm going to do is this. While dr.read, okay, what this is going to do is say, while we can still read another record, do it, or in other words, read it, and now we get to do something like txt result dot text plus equal dr, and then we'll pass in the name of the field we want to use. In this case, I'll use company name, and then just to be cute, I will do control chars new line. Now this will fail for at least one reason. We'll see if we have any other problems with it in just a moment. But I wanted to point out the most common problem that happens whenever you're writing this code. Let's go ahead and run the application. And then we'll click on the Start button, and we'll get an exception that says the execute reader requires an open and available connection. The connection's current state is closed. What we have to do is actually open up the connection before we can use it. Let's click the Continue button and add one more line of code. In this case, we'll do this: oladb connection1.open. Now whenever we open a connection to the database, it's in our best interest to actually close it when we're finished. So let's get in the good habit of doing that. Additionally, we can close the data reader when we're done with it. Ideally, whenever these objects go out of scope, their connections are automatically closed up. However, it's good to be preemptive in doing this. It makes your code more readable and, in most cases, more memory efficient. Let's go ahead and save this application and run it again, see if it works this time. And notice what we get here now. It's a list of all of the company names from the customers table of our Northwind database. So that was pretty easy. Let's review the steps. First of all, we needed to create a connection, and we did that by dragging and dropping a connection from our Server Explorer. Then we created an oladb command and set its properties, such as the database connection and, most importantly, the command text by clicking the ellipsis and opening up the Query Builder dialog where we actually wrote our query. And then in our source code, we created a variable called dr that was our bucket to read the data, so it's of type OLEDB data reader. We opened a connection to our database. We executed the execute reader command of the command object, and the result was sent to our dr object, our data reader. And then we simply looped through our data reader as long as there were records in there, appending to our txt results the single column called company name, and then at the end we closed our data reader and our connection to the database. So that wraps up the main video for this lesson. Don't forget to do the exercise for lesson 18 so you can get some hands-on exercise with accessing data in a database. Let me also say that ADO.NET is huge and that we're only really touching the tip of the iceberg here. If you don't know anything about databases, I'd really recommend that you study up on how to use databases in Microsoft Access. And once you get that under your belt, then you can probably move on to learn more about SQL Server, which is what a lot of companies use in order to manage the data for their company. Thank you.